Theme 1: History of the evolution of language teaching. Present-day trends in the teaching of English as a foreign language. The communicative approach. Index. Introduction. Relation with other themes. Current legislation. The importance of learning languages and different needs. Historical background. Grammar translation method. Different approaches. The direct method. The audiolingual method. Humanistic approaches, Suggestopedia, the silent way, community language learning, delayed oral practice, total physical response. The need to communicate. The communicative approach and communicative language teaching nowadays. The place of grammar in language teaching. Bilingual teaching and content and language integrated learning. Conclusion applicable to language teaching. Relevant bibliography. The theme I have chosen is number 1, which deals with the evolution of language teaching from the grammar translation method to present-day trends. In the first place, I will talk about the need to learn foreign languages in today's world. I will examine early and more traditional teaching methods before going on to look at more recent trends, focusing especially on the communicative approach. Finally, I will mention the role of grammar in the learning process and how this can be incorporated into a communicative type of methodology. I will finish with a conclusion relating the content of this theme to its practical application in our secondary classes. This theme is directly related to others, especially number 2, which deals with the differences between learning and acquiring languages, and many others which cover different aspects regarding the acquisition of communicative competence. The Improved Organic Law of Education, the LOMLOE, came into force in 2021 and has now been introduced in secondary education. The law deals comprehensively with the most suitable type of methodology to be implemented in our secondary school classes. The official curriculum of the Autonomous Community of Madrid contains detailed information about this. All of this is established and supported by the Council of Europe in the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. Now I will begin to talk about the evolution of language teaching throughout history. The need to teach and learn foreign languages has always existed, but the methods used have changed considerably, especially over the last 2 or 3 decades. In today's world, it is becoming increasingly more important to be able to communicate in other languages, especially English, although recently there has been a growing demand for Spanish. The way people learn languages differs according to their requirements. Scientists are probably more interested in being able to read written articles, whereas an air traffic controller has to be able to speak and understand English. Therefore, courses have to be tailored to suit the demands of the students. Early teaching methods came from Latin or French, which were important languages in the Western world. Naturally, this changed dramatically from the 15th or 16th centuries, when the English and Spanish empires began to expand. In the 20th and 21st centuries, and especially as a result of the ever-increasing dominance of the United States as a world force, politically, economically, and socially, the learning of English has become essential. It goes without saying that many methods, approaches, and techniques have been developed. If we examine language teaching from a historical perspective, we find that for many centuries the dominant method was what has always been referred to as grammar translation. As its name suggests, the main emphasis was on grammar and translation. This approach was commonly used for the teaching of classical languages like Latin or Greek and was based primarily on the written language. Students were expected to master grammatical rules and memorize long lists of vocabulary. Exercises consisted mainly of translations and reading comprehensions, with little or no attempt to deal with the more communicative aspects of the language. By concentrating more on the form of the language rather than on its functions, this approach does little to satisfy the interests and needs of language students nowadays, although it may be stimulating from a purely intellectual point of view. Many different approaches or methods were devised to try somehow to deal with students' needs and interests. Each method is normally based on one particular view of learning, many concentrating on communicative fluency instead of formal accuracy. I will now examine some of these ideas in more detail. The so-called direct method, often referred to as the natural method, attempts to involve the learner in developing speaking and listening skills in realistic everyday situations. As the learner's mother tongue is not used, they are encouraged to think in the foreign language instead of translating into or out of it. More emphasis is placed upon good pronunciation and there is a complete avoidance of grammatical rules. The problem with this method is that it is extremely difficult at times to create natural learning situations in the artificial environment of a language classroom. As a result, many teachers have adapted the approach in some ways and do allow a certain amount of L1, mother tongue, explanation. Another method became popular during the Second World War. Used to give intensive training to American soldiers, it concentrated on speaking and listening, especially accurate pronunciation. Known as the audiolingual method, it attempts, in a relatively short time span, to introduce common structural patterns in dialogues and uses a good deal of imitation and drilling. This means that the method is not particularly popular today, as learners normally need to use the language more creatively. Since the 1960s, many new approaches to foreign language learning have been devised. Considered as humanistic approaches, their aim is to make language learning as natural as possible, thus motivating learners. Most of these methods consider the student to be the important figure of the learning process. Indeed, many methods talk about a student-centered approach, meaning that students have more control over how and what they learn. Some of these humanistic approaches have been more successful than others, very often depending on the age or level of the students and the environment in which the learning process takes place. One such approach is suggestopedia, which proposes that the unused potential of the brain can be exploited through the power of suggestion. Much of the material is presented in the learner's mother tongue and then translated into the foreign language, with no attention being paid to grammatical errors. In the silent way, learners are encouraged to develop their own ways of using the language elements introduced. The amount of actual teaching is kept to a minimum, apart from the presentation of vocabulary and structures using sets of colored words. The teacher's role in community language learning is much more of that of a counselor or advisor than an actual teacher. Students use their own language and seek translations from the teacher. The idea that it is easier to receive language than produce it is the basic principle of the method known as delayed oral practice. A useful method for young learners is what is known as total physical response. Here, learners have to carry out actions following simple commands. Whatever the merits of these humanistic approaches, it was still felt that there was a need to concentrate more on language functions instead of on the form. The belief was, and still is, that learners need to be able to communicate in the foreign language and that the best way of achieving competence is if they can select the appropriate constructions for use in everyday situations. The communicative approach, as it became known, paid more attention to these functions. From the 1970s, course content started to be organized in terms of a notional or functional syllabus. It was considered necessary to deal with notions like the linguistic expression of time, duration, frequency, quantity, or location, whilst at the same time introducing the major communicative functions such as persuasion, emotional expression, and so on. Most modern-day foreign language teaching throughout the world has tended to adopt some kind of communicative methodology. Textbooks generally introduce notions and functions at the same time, although some teachers do find it difficult at times to interrelate these two concepts. For this reason, many teachers have adapted the communicative approach to suit the needs of their students, more often than not following the principles of a presentation practice production model, although there are many other variations of the communicative approach, such as the task-based learning or the engage study activate model. Grammar does have a place in language learning, but it should always be seen as a means to an end and not as an end in itself. Grammar is necessary in order to use language correctly, as if we do not follow the guidelines, language may well lose its meaning and people may not understand what we are trying to communicate. That is why, although at times it may seem boring, we cannot ignore its study. In Spain, some bilingual regions have succeeded in developing educational programs that cater for both linguistic varieties, or even a third one, in the mode of the language exposure time model. They use the L2 completely or partly for L1 instruction. That is to say, they teach some or all content subjects using the target language, which is usually the mother tongue of the teacher and the L2 of the learner. The model entails high economical and personal resources because specialized bilingual or target language teachers are needed, and students may learn two languages at the cost of losing or trailing behind other essential instructional contents. However, many years of bilingual education in some bilingual countries and communities have proved highly successful. Nonetheless, becoming bilingual in a monolingual community in which the L2 is not used at all is no easy feat. A program of this type should fulfill a number of conditions, as it needs to 1. Use the target language for part of or the whole school syllabus, including the evaluation process. 2. Employ highly linguistically competent and specialized teachers. 3. Foster exchanges with the target language community. 4. Develop or maintain a positive attitude towards both the target language and the mother tongue. 5. Start early, although this is not guarantee of success. Content on language integrated learning, CLIL, is a competence-based teaching approach that is gaining ground in many European education systems. The idea is to teach both the subject and the language, and is captured in the phrase, using language to learn, learning to use language. CLIL encourages the use of curricula which promote the right interpersonal skills, cultural sensitivity, and the communication and language abilities which are in demand by today's employers. To conclude, therefore, a sensible methodological approach must be one which takes into account both grammar and vocabulary input as well as communicative output. There should be less emphasis placed on the form of the language and more on the functions. As much as possible, classes should be student-based, with importance being given to the development of our students' self-study and self-learning techniques, and the use of communication strategies. In this way, our students should be able to achieve the minimum requirements and objectives established in the law governing secondary education. The bibliography I have used for this theme has basically been The Practice of English Language Teaching by Jeremy Harmer and The Communicative Approach and its Application by Henry Widobson. I hope you agree with me that my theme has covered all the necessary points and that it has demonstrated the importance of using up-to-date methodological principles in our classes, something which can only be of benefit to our students.